you've got the hand plug-in, hand up in the Google as well. I'd like to welcome you all to the Emerging Technologies Consortium. Today's event is Tech for Good, the Impact of Artificial Intelligence, Data for Good, and Civic Tech Calgary. And we are hosting it through Mount Royal University Library. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge that Mount Royal University is situated on the lands of the Niitsitapi and Treaty 7 nations, who include the Blackfoot, the Siksika, the Kainai, and Piikani, and the Tsuut'ina and the Iahe Nakota nations. This is also the homeland of the Métis people of Region 3. So today I would like to introduce our two speakers. We have James Stauch, who is the director of the Institute for Community Prosperity at Mount Royal University. And we have Geoff Zakaib, who is the president of Zakaib Strategies Incorporated. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us today to share your knowledge with us on this amazing topic. And I think it's a lovely one for us to end. This is our last Emerging Technologies Consortium event of our academic year for this year, for the winter semester. And so I think this is a lovely topic for us to end on. So I'll pass it over to you, James.
Great, thanks so much, Carrie and Anna. So I'll just set up here few slides. And maybe just let me know if you can see that.
Looks great, James. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. So first, a disclaimer, I'm not a computer scientist, nor do I work in high tech. I'm really only modestly tech literate, or data literate for that matter. So so why am I here presenting to you? Well, that's precisely why I'm speaking, actually. It's really out of a concern that not nearly enough people like me who work in what we call the social economy, and more specifically at the interface of civil society and learning, are actually interested enough in tech, and more specifically in artificial intelligence, or AI. So what I'll be speaking about this afternoon arose out of a conversation in early 2019 with Alina Turner, who's the founder and CEO of Helpseeker, which is a social purpose B Corp based in Calgary with a clientele across Canada. So at the Institute, we do future scanning work in a variety of areas, including tech and social trends. In this year's scan, for example, we looked at the topic of broadband inequality, recognizing that internet connectivity during the pandemic is really our lifeline to civilization. So we noticed that AI was becoming a prominent topic of discussion in many other sectors, but not yet in the social impact world. That is until I met with Alina, who is already utilizing machine learning algorithms in her work, looking at human service systems change, large-scale social change. So from that meeting, this report was born. We dove into the material, academic news stories, futurist projections, and and we produced this work called In Search of the Altruithm. So a play on altruism, an algorithm. And we felt honestly a bit like the previously shackled prisoners kind of wandering outside Plato's cave. It's tempting to avert our eyes and comforting to sink back into our regular patterns and shut this new world out. But it's something we can't avert our eyes from. So we only have 20 minutes, and I'm just going to assume that you have some basic prior knowledge of what AI is. I'm not going to dwell on definitions or history here, or for that matter, on the various often dark future scenarios which are possible with advanced AI development decades from now. Suffice it to say, though, AI may well be the most important disruption to human social organization, really, since the Neolithic Revolution. It's incalculably more important, in my view, than the pandemic. But it has to be said that the vast majority of AI development is so far either developed for commercial purposes, facilitating the commodification of more and more of our personal preferences, social networks, dreams, desires for a better world, or, and this is particularly true in China, for the purposes of state surveillance and control. Well, here we're trying to find some other ground, which is AI for social good. And what we've observed there's a lot of discussion actually in the tech world about AI's potential benefits in realms such as healthcare, education, environmental protection, human services, the arts, and so on. And there's an enormous opportunity for social impact professionals. So think of social workers, healthcare workers, teachers, artists, conservationists, and so on, as well as for nonprofit or philanthropic organizations to start paying much closer attention to AI and to become much more involved. So far, though, this sector, which is responsible for monitoring, advocating, improving social impact, and for that matter, civil discourse, is barely talking about AI. So the bottom line in the report is we say AI can be made to be generative, beautiful, and not merely ethical, but rationally compassionate and just, enriching our lives beyond what we can currently imagine. But, this is a big but, it will only do so if civil society, including citizens living at the margins and people involved in social good pursuits, whether they be artists, teachers, health professionals, social workers, and so on, become much more interested and involved. So there are many high-profile doomsayers when it comes to AI. Elon Musk speaks of it as summoning the demon. Henry Kissinger talks about it as ushering in the end of the Enlightenment. But there is another side to the AI story. So this is one. For example, Canadian health monitoring program called Blue Dot, founded by U of T researcher Kamran Khan, alerted its customers to the Wuhan coronavirus outbreak a full 9 days before even the WHO notified the public. Here's another example. So the headline says, Edmonton Police launched Community Solutions Accelerator using data to reduce crime. And again, this was shortly before the pandemic happened. The Edmonton Police Department last year launched this new initiative, which amalgamates data, AI, machine learning to combat crime in the city. It's, I think, an example both of social innovation and of systems-led leadership. It focuses on it. How do we draw the connections together between criminal activity, addictions, homelessness, mental health, and so on? And so Dale McPhee, who I consider to be a social innovator, who's also interested in tech innovation, says, we cannot continue to do things in the same way and expect a different outcome. We need to think differently, act differently, and take some risks if we want to see real results for the vulnerable people in the community. So taking our cue from that, the paper dives into a little bit of an abridged history lesson on our 4 industrial revolutions. So we hear a lot of talk about the 4th industrial revolution, but we actually dig into the first 3 industrial revolutions and ask the question, so what was the role of the social good sector or the way in which we as a society approach social good with each of these 3 previous revolutions? And it turns out there's a really big lag. There's often a 50-year or more lag between our innovation in the commercial or industrial realm and our ability to address, in a sense, the fallout from that. And what we argue forcefully is that in this 4th industrial revolution, what we have come to know as, in its current form, the charitable, the nonprofit, the kind of social impact world, it cannot be the cleanup crew in the 4th industrial revolution. It'll be too late. And instead, we're arguing that we need to be front and center and very much involved from the ground up. And I'll dig into some of the reasons as to why. I'm gonna skip over this slide. I'm sure you're all kind of familiar with some of the more socially troubling aspects of some of the early AI manifestations, whether it be deep fakes, whether it be facial recognition technology. But the important point here is don't blame the algorithms, blame who's crafting the algorithms, or more to the point, blame the unconscious bias, the lack of diversity, gender, racial, cultural, class, age, and so on in the AI development environments. And the other thing that I think is really important context and background is that the majority of the AI development out there is in the hands of a very few companies. They're either US based with sort of varying and largely dubious ethical or common good commitments, or they're Chinese state-controlled companies. And so here, this is just an interesting metaphor to me, where Mark Zuckerberg refused to show up in front of European parliamentarians, thumbing his nose essentially at this kind of common good process. And it's worth noting his own net worth increased since the dawn of the pandemic in March of 2020 by 42.3 billion and counting. So we need to push back on this corporatization of knowledge, discourse, data ownership. With all these risks at play, we also need to imagine where society may be headed, to consider how social impact practitioners can actually respond and be part of this AI-infused future. So in the report, we go into actually 4 possible scenarios, 3 of which are actually pretty grim. And I'll leave it up to others to debate whether that's actually grim or hyperbolically grim. But instead, I'm just going to jump to the 4th scenario, which we call a co-created future. And so here's where we're arguing, as Kai-Fu Lee says, that we require a blueprint for coexistence. So it's important here to recognize that, the future of AI is much less about replacement of humans and much more, at least in the near term, about enhancement and augmentation of existing work. So it's not helpful to jump to, are we going to lose our jobs to the machines, so much as how can the machines help us, and how can we create and design together. So I want you to think of, jobs like that involve compassion or creativity, or combinations of both. So think of caregivers, counselors, teachers, artists, dramatists. We see these jobs not so much as AI proof or future proof, but I think it's important to see these roles as AI ready and to figure out what that could look like. So here's a wonderful quote from one of the very few philanthropic foundations who are actually looking at this area. It's by Elizabeth Good Christofferson of the Rita Allen Foundation. So she says, used poorly, there's no doubt that artificial intelligence can serve to automate bias and disconnection rather than supporting community resiliency. So for the social sector, a values-driven, human-centered, inclusive process of development can help to mitigate the ethical risks of developing AI. Sounds great. So what does this actually look like? Well, the first place to look for clues is to recognize that there's already a whole series of innovations that are underway, or that are at least in various stages of testing and prototyping. Our report includes actually many examples within the arts. For example, I won't actually even touch on the arts unless there's a question afterward. On education, environment, health, social justice. What I can say is healthcare for sure is the kind of social good domain where there's the most vigorous AI research and development. and where there's applications nearer to widespread use. So think of diagnostics in particular. Neural network technology has either matched or exceeded the accuracy of specialists in detecting 50 different eye disorders, skin cancer, pediatric diseases. There's a great quote from the healthcare innovator Niels Jacobson, who says, "We're going to see an inflection point probably pretty soon where doctors feel it's a risk to not use machine learning and AI in their everyday practices because they don't actually want to be called out for missing an important diagnostic signal." So when you think about treatments that could be less invasive and more bespoke, many assistive devices that will be much more effective, healthcare administration that can be streamlined, prognoses for a wide range of illnesses that could be improved with AI-assisted medicine. But there's a great quote, and it's from a Wired magazine article last year that said, well, why hasn't AI saved us from the coronavirus then? But the article reminds us, and this is a quote, "Our healthcare system doesn't give up information easily to train AI systems. Privacy regulations and balkanized data silos will stop you even before the antiquated error-filled health databases do. It's possible this crisis will change that. Maybe it will push us to rethink how data is stored and shared." Now, that quote can be generalized right across the social good world. That's not specific to health by any stretch. So the other area that's worth touching on briefly is environment. McKinsey's study from 2018 identified 160 AI applications already in use or in development across all 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. That number would be probably dramatically higher today. Environment Funders Canada and the Sustainability Network released a report a few months back with some cutting-edge examples in Canada. In Alberta, the Energy Futures Lab, which is powered by the Natural Step, has developed an energy.ai program to accelerate collaborative initiatives to apply machine learning to low-carbon energy production. If one thinks about in a Calgary and Alberta context, the prospects for new and cheaper sources of energy, new modes of transportation, next-gen insulation, new modes of carbon sequestration, they'll all be within closer reach. In research, there's a really interesting trend as well. So far, the first generation of AI-generated academic research papers were done so almost as a sophisticated joke to call out the sometimes paint by numbers nature of academic writing. But it's becoming more serious, actually. There's an example from Goethe University in Frankfurt where an AI-authored textbook on lithium-ion batteries distilled insights from over 53,000 peer-reviewed papers published within the last 3 years. And it essentially developed 180-page meta-analysis. And that meta-analysis, which is, I'm sure there's people from the library on this call. It's really wild to think about the implications of that. So how do we get ready? What do we have to do? So I think a starting point here is a great quote from Lucy Bernholtz, who's a philanthropy futurist, and she runs something called the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford, which has a digital civil society lab. She says, how might a revisioning of civil society proceed when the starting assumption is that our individual and collective dependence on digital infrastructure will continue and get more complicated? So, we're talking about a sector where there was, and still is, a substantial digital divide. But we're really at a place, I guess, where there's a fork in the road. We could have some version of a dystopic future, or we could have a future that could permanently dispatch a host of medical, social, environmental, and other maladies. So fork in the road is one metaphor, but I think a more accurate one is actually an explosion. And our current task is to really set the charges with as much care and thought as we can muster. The explosion will happen, and it will one day be beyond our power to undo. But we can control the opening and early conditions. So how do we do that? So these are what we think are some helpful paths or ecosystem defining conditions. The first is an AI commons. So in McKinsey's global analysis of barriers to AI for social good, this is by far the number one. Data inaccessibility is a huge issue. So part of this is obviously pushing on the tech titans who own the vast majority of data, quality data. But of course, for funders, supporting groups like Open North, Data for Good, and you'll hear from Geoff in a bit. Watchdogs, data activists, really important. Tech and data literacy is, of course, really important across the board. We don't all have to be coders, but we have to be knowledgeable enough to know what we don't know who could help us, and to not be afraid, not have a kind of reflexive Ludditism. Hyper citizenship, human literacy, creativity, collective imagination. These are all things that are, I think, endemic and connected to, for those of you who are part of MRU, being part of a liberal arts ecosystem. I actually think the liberal arts are more important now than they've ever been. And probably now is the best time you could have ever chosen to do a philosophy degree, for example, and probably the worst time to do an accounting degree. Disruption tolerance, this is important for the nonprofit sector. It's nowhere near the commercial sector in terms of its appetite for broad scale disruption. And then public commitments is another piece of this. So, and Canada is actually doing pretty well on this front. This includes things like the Montreal Declaration, which is on socially responsible AI. We have Canada's Digital Charter and an open resource exchange. If the monopoly power of the commercial tech giants and or totalitarian regimes is not greatly circumscribed, AI will fail to serve the common good. So there's a really critical role for international, robust public policy commitments that are at least as strong as things like the Paris Accord on climate change. Brookfield Institute, CFAR, Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, are doing some great things in this area. Tying it to the UN SDGs is important, which is what the panel on AI, the International Panel on AI is looking at. So those are all important pieces. I think it's also really critical to integrate social innovation and artificial intelligence or tech innovation more broadly. I like to include a picture of Jane Jacobs here. And you might say, what does that have to do with tech innovation? Well, Jane Jacobs was really good at pointing out how the development of cities was the domain of experts, architects, engineers, transportation planners, and how citizens and small grassroots community groups needed to inject themselves into city building in order to get good cities, because otherwise we get dystopian nightmare cities that were what we were building from sort of the 50s to through the 80s, and we've recalibrated because we've discovered participation, citizen participation, collaboration, and so on. We need to do that with tech, right? If we're leaving social impact design in the hands of tech experts, no matter how well-intentioned they are, we won't get good outcomes. So it's a metaphor. We have an emerging global ecosystem. I won't belabor this other than to point out one of the groups on here is the University of Southern California Center for AI in Society, which was formed under its Faculty of Social Work. Worth checking out. Of all these initiatives, that one is, I think, holds some really important clues for how we could move forward here. And in Calgary, I actually think, although Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal are way ahead of us in terms of an AI ecosystem, and even more so if you looked at the last federal budget that came out earlier in the week. I actually think we have a niche area in tech for good in Calgary. We, of course, have Benevity, the biggest tech story in the last 10 years, Helpseeker that I've mentioned, others, including the wonderful initiatives that Geoff is heading up. Platform Calgary is a very cool ecosystem builder around tech, but it's also led by somebody, Terry Rock, who knows a heck of a lot about social innovation. So I think there's huge potential there. I'm going to just conclude with a quote. Getting humanity's last invention right, and this is from Nick Bostrom of Oxford University, who runs the Future of Humanity Institute. He said, getting this invention right from a social responsibility standpoint may be the most important existential public policy and social goal we can possibly pursue. So I couldn't agree more. So thank you. Sorry, I went a little bit over time. I apologize for that.
Thank you so much for that, James. I'll invite people to put any questions they have into the chat as we just switch over presenters here to Geoff.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Carrie, for organizing these sessions. Just fantastic initiative to pull all this together, and thanks, James, for your overview and your first part. You've kind of made my job easier by certainly setting the stage. Let me just bring up my presentation here. So, Carrie, that's good?
Looks great.
All right. Again, thanks for the invite. It's great to have all of us together here. So, as James alluded to, and we've seen this, in many different places, but the explosion of data that's occurring is just phenomenal. And that data, when you look under the covers, right, it's coming from a number of different places, right? The traditional kind of business transactional data, but over the last few years, the huge expansion in data, the human-centered data, the social interactions, and ultimately the machine-generated data as well. So this is actually, started, and it is certainly accelerating as time goes on. But you know what? Data is just a resource, and on its own, it's frankly worthless. It's bits and bytes that have to be put into context. So this is a familiar picture that you'll see, but it's really worth thinking about, right? Because the data, we talk about that data, the explosion of data, but we have to refine it. We have to move it up that triangle, and putting it into context, into information, using it and combining it in terms of knowledge, and then putting it into action. So the wisdom we gain from the past and looking to the future, whether it's artificial intelligence or data analytics or whatever, moving that into what we can actually use. So data in the social sector. So we've heard from James, and what we've just seen is that the amount of data, but also the importance of data, is just ever increasing. And the use of that data, the most advanced use, of course, is in business and commercial purposes. But nonprofit social organizations are doing amazing things in our society, and they're trying to do good, doing the best that they can, but often lack the skills and resources, to collect, understand, and use that data to make better decisions and to increase their impact. That's on one hand. On the other hand, we have an amazing pool of professionals, tech-oriented folks that have knowledge and skills that want to become engaged and put that knowledge and skills to use. So this worldwide movement of data for social good has been happening over the last 10 years or so. Many initiatives. DataKind was one on one of James's slide. That's a group in the US that kind of kicked a lot of this stuff off. Go to their website, datakind.org. Some great stories there. So a lot of work being done, a lot of resources. There are philanthropists and others that are putting dollars into this Data for Good movement. All kinds of resources being developed to help us take a look at that. Lots of organizations are looking a bit deeper, though, into nonprofit social organizations. So it's not just, of course, about the data itself. To use data effectively, there's much more involved, right? So the leadership that gets it, to put resources into it. The culture, which recognition of the importance of data, but also the culture around giving for philanthropists and for foundations to provide resources to these organizations to use data effectively, and the tools and all on the capacity building that's required. What underlies a lot of this, but doesn't get discussed as much as it should, are around this absolutely has to be done in ethical ways. And data ethics around artificial intelligence, more and more is getting a lot of attention, as it should, and we have to continue to do that. So these kind of core overarching ethical principles, respect for human dignity, informed consent, vulnerable persons, respect for privacy and confidentiality, for justice and inclusiveness, and balancing, maximizing, minimizing the harm while maximizing the benefit. So all these things considered, what's popped up is organizations like Data for Good. What we do is really is data in the service of humanity, combining the need from the nonprofit and social sector, the organizations that want to use the data, with the data professionals and others that have a passion for data and want to give back to society. So we're a collective of passionate, socially minded volunteers using knowledge and skills to try to make our communities better through data. And our aim is to help those organizations harness the power of data and really leverage impact in their communities. Data for Good itself is a national not-for-profit. I'm on the board of the national organization, and I lead the Calgary chapter. And we have 9 chapters from Vancouver all the way to the Maritimes. We've been around since 2013 here in Calgary, and have had amazing uptake. Over 2,000 members organized through Meetup. Just shows you that Calgary is a real hotbed and such potential for this sort of thing. We do events called Datathons, which are longer kind of weekend events in better times, working with organizations, smaller project-based data core activities, as well as monthly meetups. So please look us up on meetup.com. Go to Calgary and do a search for Data for Good, and please join us. We have a website, a national website, and our Twitter handle is there. So just a few of our activities. We actually have one of our meetups, so the 4th Thursday is tomorrow. So this is a really interesting and important discussion on First Nations data sovereignty, using the principles of OCAP, stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. So I'd invite you to join us tomorrow evening for that. Some of our projects, these smaller projects, usually we have 3 or 4 going at any particular time. And these are some of the ones on the go. Our datathons, our previous datathons, and those that are put on by other chapters as well. But of course, and actually, I want to mention our next datathon is with the Calgary Homeless Foundation, our partner this year. So in early June, we'll be having a virtual online datathon, and then hopefully by next November, we'll do our face-to-face Friday night, all day Saturday, Sunday morning. But of course, the ecosystem is not just about data. There's this emerging ecosystem about technology for good. And I don't have time to go into all of this, but it's just amazing. And there are groups that are promoting this big picture of technology for good. Aspects of this would include digital social innovation. So something that James alluded to, right? So combining the social aspect with the technology aspect. And one particular component is civic tech. So what is it? Civic tech is a movement where citizens and governments work together to use data, technology, and design for public good. And really the value of this is to grow public engagement and enhance services in ways that are more inclusive, responsive, innovative, open, and citizen-centered. So this actually is a global movement. A bunch of groups here to take a look at. Code for All is facilitating that worldwide discussion. Started in the US with groups like Code for America. In Canada, we have Code for Canada that is facilitating the variety of civic tech groups in Canada. So we consider civic tech to be an innovation space where people across sectors can come together to build community and to solve problems. This is happening across the country. I mentioned Code for Canada, kind of providing kind of a backbone organization. Toronto, Ottawa, Edmonton, and of course here in Calgary as well. So we started in Civic Tech Calgary in 2017, bringing people together across the community, leveraging technology, support from the City of Calgary and the Civic Innovation YYC that's happening there, a group called Rainforest Alberta, that tech ecosystem, people that want to do good with technology. And really trying to break down the silos, which are traditional silos in this kind of ecosystem. So whether it's the citizens and communities or the various government organizations, the City of Calgary and others, the entrepreneurs and startups and education, universities, or whether it's the business community as well, pulling that together. So 2017, we started 850 plus members. We meet on the second Tuesday of the month, so look for that, and please join us as well. You can sign up through Meetup. We work on the basis of projects, so we have hackathons and various events, and folks come to us with great ideas, and we launch projects. So a couple examples of those. A really great project called Volley. Alice Lamb came to us, no tech background, but a really engaged in volunteering in Calgary. And she wanted to build an app that would really help young people and others volunteer. Launched it at one of our hackathons. A couple years later, if you go to volleyapp.com, it's an amazing app and website that's connected thousands of people across Calgary for volunteer opportunities. We're doing some very cool things around blockchain for social good and how the nonprofit social sector can use technologies like blockchain, which is an emerging technology. And another example was we're happening right now with trying to create what's called a civic user testing group in Calgary. So we had this came up at one of our hackathons with a bunch of volunteers with Civic Tech. We had the amazing opportunity to come into Dr. Catherine Pearl's Civic Innovation course that just concluded, and work with the students on this idea. So the students were charged with a couple challenges. How can we leverage digital social innovation and tech for good in Calgary? But also they put together a case for support and did a bunch of research and generated some amazing ideas about how civic tech can take this idea forward and actually launch a civic user testing group in Calgary. So we have a project going right now, and if you want to join us, please do that. It's a great idea. It's civic user testing is this concept of a grassroots group that facilitates better, more inclusive and accessible testing by engaging residents in the creation of technology that's meant to serve them. But importantly, it's something that's happening around North America. It is important from a civic point of view, from inclusion, incorporating those that are less represented and underrepresented in a process of helping them to test applications from the city, from startups, and from others, incorporating diverse perspectives. It helps with things like digital literacy. And in places like Chicago, they have thousands of testers now and help to increase access to the internet, improve technology skills and literacy, and actually help the startup community and the government deliver better services and apps. So Toronto is doing this, and others. Toronto, it's called Gathering Residents to Improve Technology. And our conclusion was, let's do it in Calgary. So let's come together. You can join our project and we can kind of move it forward. So I absolutely agree with James that Calgary is a place for digital social innovation and for tech for good, and many ways for you to engage in that. Data for Good, Civic Tech Calgary. Some evidence of that, though, are things really are happening in Calgary. So, for example, the YYC Data Society is bringing data-related groups together. If you go to yycdata.ca, you'll see how we're trying to collaborate and communicate in a much more effective way. And the final example is platform. And so Data for Good, Civic Tech Calgary, we're both community partners at Platform Innovation Center. And there's over 50 partners. So this is the innovation center that's being built across 9th Avenue from the library. It's not only a physical structure, though, but a place to bring everybody together to help build community. So with that, thanks very much. I will stop sharing and we'll return to
Thank you so much, Geoff. Really great opportunities there for people to get involved in our city. And James really set that up for how important that is. We don't have any questions in the chat yet, so if anybody would like to pop some questions in there, or feel free to unmute your microphone too if you wanted to ask a question. But I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. Something that you both brought up, and obviously we're hosting this session through the Mount Royal University Library, and something that came up in both of your talks, which of course with my, my library hat on, and I know there's at least one librarian in our midst here, is this idea of tech and data and digital literacy and how important that is. I'm wondering, maybe James, if you could speak to anything that you've come across in terms of academics and universities, Have you come across anywhere that is really doing a great job of augmenting what we have traditionally done in libraries in terms of digital literacy to really kind of take it into the 21st century? I know there's a conversation that we're having on campus, and I just wondered if you or if Geoff had any insights there for how can we build those literacies for our students so that everyone we're graduating with is literate in technology, in data, in all of the things that they need to enter into the workplace that is the future.
So a great question, Carrie. I don't recall looking specifically at libraries and the role of libraries. We did look at a number of university-based initiatives that were bringing together computer scientists, data scientists, and either social workers or a broader suite of people who were kind of looking at the social or common good realm. So sociologists, even philosophers in some cases, artists, teachers, and so on. So there's lots of really interesting examples of cross-fertilization in the research domains or in the applied research domains. I don't recall anything specific to libraries other than, I would say some of the profs that I'm aware of at MRU that are involved in honors programs with their students, where the students are really, using challenged to use as many of the library resources as they can. There's more and more appetite and a push emerging for those students to not just focus on conventional research papers, but to consider podcasts, to consider other forms of communicating information in a engaging and digestible way as part of their suite of competencies. And I think just in general, the move toward micro-credentials, the move towards thinking more about 21st century skills, which include much more lucidity in how we communicate information and much less reliance on the written word. It's also a challenge, by the way, with indigenization. I think all of those speak to the importance of libraries evolving, from places of that are book based or literature based to a much more of a mosaic of ways in which information is communicated orally, verbally, visually, and so on, and how we organize that information.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yeah, it is helpful. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on do you feel that students who are graduating now have enough of an understanding of things like artificial intelligence and data literacy?
No, I mean, but I'm not to be relied on because it's pretty anecdotal.
Yeah.
But I would say no. I mean, we're still. I'm a big fan of liberal arts and the need for cross-fertilization. But I think I really think we can be much more strategic and intentional about what that means. And getting back to this idea of hyper citizenship, it's not enough to just to encourage a computer scientist to take a course in Greek classics, or conversely, to have a sociology student do a basic computer science intro course and hope that they might do that. We need to be much more intentional about, well, what are the suite of citizenship and sort of 21st century skills capabilities that all students ought to possess to some degree. So one of the things we're working on with Helpseeker is actually it's a prototype for a program called Wayfinders, where we would work in partnership with them and Career Services to essentially prime students through a co-curricular learning model on a set of competencies that include design thinking, systems thinking, social sector knowledge, data literacy, tech literacy, and there's one or two others, And they can skip those units if they can prove they have that competency anyway. But we're trying to get students on a sort of platform where they all have the same basic literacy around some of these skills. And then they do a work integrated learning experience at Helpseeker. So that's what we're working on right now. And I mean, that's pretty boutique. That's only going to serve, somewhere between probably 10 and 30 students a year. But it speaks to, we're seeing that is a gap with a lot of students.
Yeah, that's a great initiative, James. I'm really happy to hear that. That's awesome. Geoff, I wonder if you have some thoughts from your realm with regards to, because you also brought up this idea of digital literacy in the community. I wonder if you have some thoughts about how do we build these competencies for people who are not necessarily having the opportunities that James is talking about.
Yeah, no, I think it's extremely important, and I think the sort of the concept of a digital citizenship, right? And as digital citizens, we, more and more, this is going to be a critical learning, and I think it's starting to be understood, even at the primary and high school levels, right? Where digital literacy, data literacy, ethics is hugely important for us to understand the ethical underpinnings of this. And speaking of libraries, I think libraries can provide a big role, right? Because the library is something that welcomes everybody, that can be a place for everybody to go, whether it's the public library with citizens across Calgary or at the universities and colleges as well. So the library is a place to curate knowledge, and so just one example would be something called open data, right? So there's hundreds of data sets from the government of Canada, the province of Alberta, the city of Calgary. They've made these open data sets available. An amazing resource, right? And the library can help curate that resource, but also help in the capacity of individuals to use it. So putting on a training workshop or a one-day session or a couple hours, right? Fundamental skills around how to use data, how to use technology could be really worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Geoff. We actually have a question in the chat from Stephen Hodder, and he says, thank you for your informative talks. Data and AI have massive social and political implications. Are our political bodies being proactive on these topics, and are knowledge gaps being addressed in earnest?
Well, I would say they're not I would say they're reactive. I think it would give them too much credit to say they're proactive, and in some cases they're not even reactive. I mean, look how long it's taken to figure out that we even should tax some of the tech giants like Netflix and Facebook, right? Like it's only now in the federal budget, and it's not even going to be implemented maybe until next year. Now that's low-hanging fruit. There are commendable initiatives that hold some promise, like the Digital Charter, the Open Resource Exchange, that I think Canada is probably relative to a lot of other countries trying to show some leadership on. So that's promising, but I worry that it's just nipping at the edges. I think at a municipal level we could start there. I think there's a lot more we could do around opening. I mean, Geoff will speak to this far more intelligently than I could, but we know that there are initiatives at City Hall that I think are interesting, but need to be opened up to the broader public, and we need easier access to that data and ways of understanding that data. So I think there's a lot of leadership that can happen at a local level, but of course the big questions will be CRTC and at the national and even international level?
Yeah, I mean, governments are just notoriously, risk averse, right? And data and AI and analytics and all that stuff is often perceived as a risk to them, right? Because if they can't control the agenda, if they can't control the answer, sometimes they don't want the work to be done or the data used as effectively as it could be. So we have to be conscious of that as citizens. We have to demand, it's our data, right? This data is being collected by governments, by others. It's ours to actually be used. So we have to push for that. We have to be very careful, though, about things like bias that are already incorporated in the bias. There's a documentary called Coded Bias. You can look that up. I think it's on Netflix now. An amazing film that talks about some of the dangers of technology in this sort of aspect as well. But I don't want to be totally negative, right? There's some good examples where government is starting to get it and using it effectively. For example, the government of Alberta a few years ago helped to fund an initiative to create what's called an Alberta nonprofit data strategy. So I worked on phase 1 of that. Phase 2, a group called PolicyWise worked on it. Now we're into phase 3, but that's recognizing the value of data in the nonprofit sector and the role of government and civil society to actually use our data for social purposes more efficiently and effectively.
Thanks so much, Geoff. So we're at 1 o'clock. I would like to thank you both sincerely. This was a really great and such an important conversation to have today as we've been talking about emerging technologies. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, sharing the future in which we are all going to be a part of, and also sharing some of the ways that we can get involved in the city and involved in really our citizen participation. So I really appreciate your words today. And thank you to everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Carrie and Anna.